Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello, everybody. It is Monday, August the 18th, 2025. Happy Monday. I hope you're all in the office working hard because that is the subject of today's show on work. We've done lots of shows in the past, certainly in the last few weeks, on the subject of work, how it's changing. We had my old friend Julia Hobsbawm on the show talking about what she calls the death of the American way of work, shift in the nature of how we work from the office to the home. And of course, we talked a lot about AI, and we also talked a great deal about AI with Dror Poleg, one of the great futurists around these days, who argues that AI is too busy to take our jobs, so we should worry less about AI than other pundits are suggesting when it comes to work. There'll always be a Monday, according to Dror. We'll always be in the office. We'll always have work as human beings. My guest today also suggests that we shouldn't panic. In fact, that is his brand. Mark Eltringham is based in the English Midlands, where work, or at least industrial work, perhaps began. He's the publisher of Workplace Insight, and he had a very interesting piece in response to both my interview with Julia Hobsbawm and with Dror Poleg, suggesting that we need to acknowledge the role privilege plays in the way we talk about work. As I said, Mark is joining us from the English Midlands, halfway between Birmingham and Manchester, near Stoke-on-Trent. Mark, welcome to the show. I'm thrilled that you are a listener and that you wrote an interesting response to my two conversations with Julia and Poleg. Is that right? Could we, in geographical terms, might we position the origins of modern industrial work in the English Midlands?
Well, I think Shropshire might make a better claim for it, which is on the Welsh borders, but a little bit to the west of us. So Ironbridge, I think, is generally acknowledged as the sort of cradle of the Industrial Revolution. But, like a lot of places, this area was forged in the Industrial Revolution, the most associated with ceramics and with coal mining and with steel production. But those things are not what they were. And, we're still adjusting to the modern world in this area, I would say.
So before we get to modernity and industrialization, what was the world? And seems to be, Mark, a great debate, an ongoing debate. It's actually been a debate for the last 300 or 400 years. Rousseau, Marx, many other thinkers have been involved in this debate. What was the nature of work before the industrialization? Was there such a thing as work or jobs? One of my old friends, Douglas Rushkoff, wrote a whole book about it, suggesting that before modernity, there wasn't even such a thing as jobs. He didn't suggest that we didn't work, but jobs didn't exist. So how would you define work and jobs in the pre-industrial age?
Yeah, I don't know. I read a book probably a few years ago now, which looked at serfdom and how, and perhaps arguing that we are in some ways returning to something similar. We would dress it up nowadays in a different way, because it's related to the gig economy, portfolio careers, and the need for constant reinvention, which is what some people like Charles Handy would have, how they would have phrased it. But yeah, certainly, I think pre-industrial revolution, you might have had a role, but you wouldn't have had a job in the same way. That's certainly true.
Charles Handy, I think recently died, was a close friend of Julia Hobsbawm. I know she was very inspired by him. Should we be careful then, Mark? Are you suggesting, should we be careful for people, and I would include somebody like Rushkoff in this, who are nostalgic for a way of work which has somehow gone away, which when things go away, they always seem better than they were when they existed. In other words, should we be nostalgic for what you call serfdom?
Well, there is. Well, I mean, this might bring us on to the, what I was talking about in my piece. And when you ask people who are in the gig economy or who have, in unstable work, what they would prefer, there is still this yearning for stability. They want a consistent income and knowing where they stand with their work, and that was especially driven, I think, by recently, the experience of lockdown, where if you were freelance or you had some uncertain work, your income basically just stopped. Whereas if you were in a job, you had a way of getting around that, with your employer and with the government support for it. And so I think that sort of fixed in people's minds that maybe, freelance work wasn't for them. And the government has done certain things with tax changes in the UK that also discourage people from taking on freelance work. Because you obviously don't have the benefits with freelance work of holiday pay, sick pay, pension, etc., etc. And but there are benefits from
the benefits, of course, is you don't have a boss. Can we, as I said, you do a lot of thinking about the workplace. In fact, that's the name of your publication, Workplace Insight. So you're continually looking into it. Mark, we talk about kind of a structural and a tactical shift in the nature of work. On the one hand, you mentioned the lockdown. COVID changed things automatically overnight. Literally, in a few days, we went from all working in an office or working traditionally to working from home or not working at all. That was tactical because no one could have expected it. And now it seems in some ways like a distant memory. And on a structural sense, of course, we have the whole issue of AI, which Julia and particularly Dror Poleg writes about. So those, in terms of thinking about changes within the workplace, might we talk about a strategic and a structural shift? In other words, one short term, which may not last, and the other, which is long term. And just as Keynes famously said about the long term, in the long term, we're all dead. Inevitable one way or the other when it comes to AI and changing how we work.
Well, I mean, I think this comes to the point I was making, which is that what you're talking about impacts maybe a third or maybe 40 or 50% possibly of people directly in terms of what work they do. Because one thing that you notice about the conversations about AI is it is about knowledge work, and inevitably that is the case. But for a lot of other people, that won't have a direct impact on what they do. And and the same is true of things like the 4-day week, which is another sort of privileged conversation that if you are cleaning toilets, that is not something at this stage that automation is going to necessarily have a direct impact on, and nor should it. I mean, those are the people obviously who will, who are living quite precariously and will change jobs for a relatively small sum of money. And there are a lot more people like that are left out of these conversations that I think, as I think I said in the piece, it can be tiresome, if you are Julia or Dror who are talking about bigger picture issues, it would be tiresome to constantly sort of caveat everything you say by reminding that these people exist. But at the same time, if you're going to declare that things are dead or dying or whatever, it's probably useful to do it at some point.
You use the P word. Privilege. It's a word that often gets thrown around, Mark, as you know. Some people use it as a weapon. Some people use it perhaps to defend themselves. Your piece on the Julia Hobsbawm and Dror Poleg conversations that I had suggested, or you argued at least, it was a thought piece from you in your Workplace Insight. And I'm quoting the title, "We need to acknowledge the role privilege plays in the way we talk about work." Are you suggesting that theorists of work, whether they're Julia Hobsbawm or Dror Poleg, Julia writing from North London, Dror from New England in the United States, by definition, these structural conversations about AI in the office, that they are privileged, and we're forgetting about your toilet cleaners?
Yeah. Well, do you know what? After I published it, I kind of got the impression that it wasn't the right word. I turned 60 this year, and I trust my opinions on things less and less as I go on. And I did think, actually, I've done it now. I have to kind of run with it. But actually, it's probably the more accurate word is solipsism. And I think, but again, you would have to explain yourself, or I would have to explain myself.
Well, you've got the opportunity now, Mark. So you're taking back the word, you're taking the P word back, and you're replacing it with the S word, solipsism.
Yeah, I think it might be more.
What's the difference between? So maybe we'll change the title. We need to acknowledge the role solipsism plays in the way we talk about work. In any, whether it's solipsism or privilege, what's the point you're making?
The point I'm making is that what people will do, and I feel terrible about doing this. Julia's a lovely person. I agree with her on almost everything.
We all love to beat up Julia Hobsbawm. She loves it. She likes a bit of pain.
Right. Okay, but what people tend to have a tendency to do, and it's not just Julia or Draw, it's me sometimes as well, it's everybody, is they will take their own experiences and preferences and project them onto the whole world and just say, okay, well, and the way it often manifests is with this sort of output of saying something is dying or dead. And, we've been watching it at, playing out at speed over the last 5 years. And, including from some people who should know a lot better who have been doing this. And, and by definition, it can't be true. I mean, the perfect example of it, and this doesn't apply to Julia, because whatever else, I think she takes a balanced view on pretty much everything. But I remember reading a piece in the Times in 2021, and they interviewed a guy who works in the City of London, and what he liked about remote work was that he could be in the pool at 5 o'clock rather than traveling back through London Bridge. And I just thought, yeah, that's good for you, mate. Bully for you. I'm pleased that's for you, but that doesn't actually tell us anything about remote work. It tells us, he can enjoy it for his own reasons. But I can't remember what the headline of the piece was, but it used him as an example of the death of the office. And
that's just, Mark, isn't that just bad journalism? I mean, a lot of journalists are lazy and they call up their friend who works down the street in an office. Yeah. They want to write a piece on the changes and things. But good journalists do their research. And in defense, I don't know whether it's a solipsism or privilege or whatever it is, AI is having a profound impact, or is currently and will continue to have a profound impact on how we work. So what's wrong with thinking about it in those terms?
Well, I think because of the way that it's projected out into the world, and I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that was in the Times, but you will often see it in the management magazines. They will take one part of the elephant and try and sort of describe the whole beast, and it's not necessarily always appropriate. I mean, probably the most prominent workplace thinker of the last 5 years has been a guy called Nick Bloom at Stanford University, and his work is fantastic.
And what's his? I need to actually get him on the show. What's his basic argument?
Well, his basic argument is, he does the research into things like productivity for people working from home, and he produces masses of data on this. So it is, what he says is sort of, gold standard stuff. But when that's filtered through the media and through commentators, what you produce is we kind of developed this idea of finding the hybrid working sweet spot in let's say it was late 2020, 2021. I think it really sort of took hold, that kind of thinking. And, and people got obsessed with this idea of like 3 days in the office, 2 at home, or whatever it might be, and that is based on his work, but it's not his fault, because what he will do is take across the whole economy. He will say, okay, the best thing for the whole economy is if on average everybody works in this pattern. But of course, that doesn't tell you about what is appropriate for an individual firm or an individual employee. So, and I think a lot of people got deceived by this idea that you've got this average and you try and work towards it. and and people in with bigger brains than me and bigger budgets were making decisions that weren't necessarily correct for them. I mean, a perfect example of this is what HSBC are going through at the moment, because they moved from Canary Wharf into the centre of London, and what they've now discovered, having overcorrected in terms of return to office mandates, is that they haven't got enough space. Another example was like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's a British politician, pronounced that everybody should get back into the office in the public sector. He was then told, of course, that yet again, the offices hadn't been designed for full occupancy in the first place. And so there wasn't enough space to have everybody back in the office. So that sort of predated 2020 as well. So you've got this situation where people are making decisions based on economic data that may not apply to them.
But isn't it the thing with work and the office is ironic and confusing? I mentioned the short-term nature of COVID, the long-term shifts in the economy. My wife works for Google, which is one of the more advanced and you'd think virtual companies in the world, where they wouldn't care where you work as long as you get your work done. But probably like HSBC and every other big company, they've instituted quite strict rules about coming into the office, which a lot of people don't like. A lot of workers, Google people don't like, because they'd rather, for different reasons, work for home. Why, Mark, and this is what you spend your day thinking about at Workplace Insight, why are senior managers at companies as diverse as HSBC and Google, why do they want to get their people back into the office? Because it doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, and you know the data here, and I'd be interested from somebody. I need to get Bloom actually on the show.
You certainly do, yeah.
Stanford. What does the data tell us about whether or not people are more or less productive in the office as opposed to home? Because, of course, the argument is you don't have to waste your time commuting. You can work in your pajamas or even without your pajamas. You don't have to be continually going in and leaving the office to get lunch or drinks. So what does the data tell us about productivity for your white, these are not, we're not talking about the toilet cleaners here, but your white collar worker, your typical white collar worker, whether at a bank or a tech company, are they more or less productive if they go into the office?
Well, yeah, there you go. There's the question. I'll tell you one thing first. I think it was kind of interesting that the return to office mandate movement was spearheaded by tech companies, who you would think have a vested interest in people working remotely in many ways.
Who in particular? Was it Google, Facebook?
Well, it was Google. Microsoft did it as well. Who else? I think Apple certainly did something, but it's the what used to be the FANG group of companies were all sort of talking about this, and amongst the first sort of cohort firms saying we need to get people back in. And I think the impression that I get, I had a conversation with Kay Sargent of the Architects HOK earlier in the year at a conference in London, and she'd be an interesting person maybe to get on to the podcast if you're talking about work as well. But what Kay and I were talking about was, like, if you ask people whether they're more productive working from home, the question they're hearing might not be the one that the company is asking, because as is the case with a lot of contentious issues in the modern world, words are used in different ways, and that can be where a lot of friction comes up. Because if you ask somebody whether they're more productive from home, and they take it to mean that can you work through your to-do list and empty your inbox and whatever more easily working from home, chances are they're going to answer yes. If you're Microsoft, and I think Microsoft did a large-scale inquiry into what was happening across all of their sites across the world, you probably dig out the link for this study they did of themselves, and I think they did it with, let's say, Harvard or Stanford or whatever it was. And what they found was their ability to produce also complete projects had fallen away. So although people thought they were more productive, the company saw it differently. They were seeing different outcomes. So you kind of have this, and I think this is something when I read Nick's reports, he does bring this kind of thing out. That you've got two different ways of looking at what the question is being asked.
Yeah, and in terms of the tech companies leading the way, skeptics, people who don't like big tech companies, and that includes probably most of us now, might argue that it's all about surveillance. These companies have technologies which are creating what we now call surveillance capitalism. And just as they create tools for other people to watch everybody, they like to watch their own workers. Jeff Bezos, of course, is probably the great pioneer of this, both philosophically, if that's the right word, and also in terms of the products and technologies he was developing within Amazon. He's no longer the CEO of Amazon, but he was quite influential here. So do you think there's an element of control here, that these big tech companies simply want to make sure that people are doing what they say they're doing? And of course, Bezos and others are pioneering technology that will actually literally enable us to determine productivity, what we might think of as digital Taylorism.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely the case. But what you then do is you give people perverse incentives to try and look busier than they might be. You know, there is the case of, the number of mouse jigglers that sort of came onto the market, because people could pretend they were at their desk when they weren't. And we get sort of we get labels for workplace trends that usually consist of people pretending to work. Now, people have always done that. I used to do it when I had a job. You walk around with bits of paper. You leave your jacket on the back of your seat when you're.
Mark, I can't resist making this. You live near Stoke-on-Trent, so you've got that Shakespearean quality in your blood, don't you?
Well, quite.
And life is a stage. The Office is a stage, right? So it's the ultimate modern theatre. Shakespeare would have enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But and I think you're seeing that now. But then again, you've got to. I don't think the office industry is always very good at making the business case for its existence, and I think this is an ongoing problem. There's, they will talk about things like water cooler moments, which is, from my point of view, is pretty much nonsense. Whereas they should be talking about things like weak ties. They should be talking about things like propinquity.
Another word. No, what is propinquity?
Propinquity is I think first cropped up with in a James Bond novel with a chapter called "Nothing Propinks Like Propinquity," but it was adopted by one of Kennedy's aides, Douglas Ball, I think. So yeah. So what it basically means is, if you want to, be influential, you need to be near the source of the influence.
Yeah, it means from the state of being close to someone or something, proximity. So
there you go. And I think
you're learning very informally, Mark. You're the Shakespeare. Can we call you the Shakespeare of Stoke-on-Trent?
No, Shakespeare wasn't from Stoke.
Where was he from?
Stratford-on-Avon.
Isn't that quite close there?
It's not too far, but we have a guy called Arnold Bennett here, who's probably the greatest author from Stoke.
Okay, well, that was propinquitous, I guess. I like that word. I'm going to borrow. I'm going to steal that. I'm not even going to acknowledge it in future. I'm not going to acknowledge it.
Quite right.
So, Mark, let me ask you another question. And the water cooler moment, of course, or the water cooler argument suggests that people work better when they talk to one another rather than talk on Zoom or just work at home on their own. But there are two questions here. Maybe we need to get Nick Bloom on to answer these propinquitously. But firstly, are people more productive when they work with others? I know these are big questions. But secondly, maybe even more importantly, do people like working? Like working in the office? The two classic arguments: on the one hand, I like working from home because I just don't want to be. I want to have to talk to people I don't particularly like. On the other hand, the water cooler culture creates a sense of solidarity. That was Steve Jobs' argument, actually, in his redevelopment of the Apple offices down in Cupertino. He wanted everyone to be seen all the time, not just perhaps for surveillance reasons, but because he felt people worked better when they worked as a collective.
Yeah, well, I think when he was talking, I think you'd have still looked at the idea of proxemics, and that was if you can see somebody, you will you're more likely to communicate with them. I think the dynamics of that have changed since he would have been making those statements. But I think what does happen if you're together. Well, I mean, I'm going to answer your question. I actually think what people like doing is working in a good working culture, and that can manifest itself in an office. But I think one of the things we keep on missing is the fact that actually, if you've got a good working culture and a badly designed office, people can be happy there. But the reverse is not true. If you've got a bad culture, you can have a nice office; it won't compensate for it. But the main point about working together in a space, I think, is more to do with things like weak ties than it is to do with being able to see each other these days. So that is the idea that if you are, you might know person X, but they know person Y. So if you've got a particular problem, they can say, "Oh, you need to talk to Y about that," and you have those sort of interconnections are much easier to form when you are in the same physical space. Doesn't mean you can't compensate for it in virtual space, but it's just something that you have to be aware of. But sorry, go on.
Well, you can't open a newspaper these days, or not, certainly an online newspaper like yours, and not come across something about loneliness.
Yeah,
I'm not convinced that we're quite as lonely as some people think we are, or perhaps as we think we are ourselves. But do you think that the office makes us more or less lonely? I mean, there's the dystopian take on the office, where we sit in our cubicle and we're lonelier and lonelier. And then, of course, there's the other, maybe not utopian, but certainly more cheerful take, which suggests that at least we have people to talk to.
Well, yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, but then those are the sorts of things that come down to individual cases. We had, I'm part of a sort of translation group with a German firm that we work with, and they were asking about a particular sort of the use of the word lonely and alone in a particular piece of text. And I think those are two distinct things, and they are in German as well. And being alone is not the same thing as being lonely, is it? And you can be lonely in company, can't you? I think that's the thing. So I think the loneliness thing obviously is or it seems to be a big issue. But we don't work in cubicles in Europe. Never really have. We, except for maybe in call centers. We've never bought into the sort of whole Dilbert, Gremlins type office space type sort of office environment. It doesn't translate here. But just putting everybody into a building and expecting them to bounce off each other like peas is not really a good enough way of thinking about the office.
Is that why office furniture is so important? You wrote a nostalgic piece about the iconic office furniture products of yesterday. And of course, on your site, there are lots of, I think, ads for office furniture. That may not be entirely coincidental, but is furniture important? Not just furniture, chairs and tables, but the way the thing's designed. Silicon Valley tried to reinvent the office. I'm not sure if they have with their open plan. What's your take on that, Mark?
Well, I think one of the things we're hearing from sort of major occupiers now, Sage is a perfect example, who are opening a number of offices around the world this year and next, I think. When you talk to, say, Neil Usher, who's the head of workplace for Sage globally, he will tell you that they're basically going back to the same principles of design that would have been relevant in 2019. They might be doing it in different mixes, but they're offering people desks, for example, in large numbers, but also a choice of different spaces for different tasks and to interact with people in different ways, which is called activity-based working. So they're kind of going back to that, and you're hearing it from other large corporates as well. They're not all turning their offices into basically sort of hospitality spaces, so people can come together to build relationships and then go home to do the actual work. That is not what is going on in the corporate world. But I think in terms of office furniture, I think the way of understanding the marketplace, and I can only really talk about the UK, is when you look at sales of office furniture, that tells you far more about how people work than anything you will read in our magazines. I'm not, I've got to be careful about how I put this. But when you look at sales office furniture, you realize that most people work in very, very mundane surroundings. They work at desks with basic chairs, blue carpets, and and they will buy some pictures and a pot plant to cheer the place up, and that's pretty much it for most people. And so what determines how much they enjoy their job and working with their colleagues will be the culture and their relationships, not the design of the office.
Yeah, and of course, the office itself was a show pioneered in the UK. So everyone, and the British have that particular grey ironic sensibility to make fun of the office and make it as boring and dystopian as possible. But let's come back. Let's be very privileged, Mark, and come back to AI, because it is changing things. I take your point about it's not going to change everything overnight and it doesn't impact everyone. But why do you need a big desk when computers now will eventually get sewn into your hand? Why do you need a big desk when more and more people are working on their phones?
Yeah.
Why do we need printers or fax machines? That kind of technology is going away. It's becoming increasingly personalized and portable. So AI, and of course AI will change everything in the sense that now we have algorithms that, in theory at least, do our work for us as white collar workers, maybe not as toilet cleaners.
Yeah, but we're not quite there yet, are we? I mean, I think
we're on the way. It's not something that you can ignore.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I think desks have probably shrunk as much as they can. Most people work at fairly, because a desk is basically just a table these days. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when a desk would have been a huge thing with a massive cathode ray tube monitor in the corner. And, those days have obviously fully gone. Although inexplicably, those desks still get sold. Well, I think that's more to do with peacocking rather than anything else. And so I can see the point, but right now, based on what we know, people like that space within the office that is just their own, and they still work at laptops and with tablets and stuff like that. They're not wired directly into Google or whatever just yet. Although I take the point that that is the direction of travel. That's not where we are just yet. And so I don't know how that is going to change things. We use AI in certain ways, but
people can like what they want. I mean, another British author wrote a book many years ago in the 16th century, Thomas More, called Utopia, which imagined a future where sheep would eat men. And he was writing about the enclosure movement, which of course was one of the great structural economic shifts in world history that was pioneered in some ways in the UK. Workers can like whatever they want, but it doesn't matter. They're not going to, just because they might like a desk or a big computer doesn't secure their job. I take your point on privilege, blah, 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 but don't workers have to acknowledge the technological economy rather than the other way around?
Well, yeah, I think it's coming for all of us in one way or another, and we're having to adjust not just the way that we work, because we use AI in limited ways in what we do at the moment, but it's coming for our business model. I mean, we all, are very much aware in sort of online publishing the way that SEO and search have changed in just the last couple of years and the impact that it's having on traffic.
How's it impacting your business at Workplace Insights? We did a show on that a couple of days ago about how some entrepreneurs are trying to integrate SEO technology into AI with or without success. But is your business being dramatically impacted? I mean, what is your business at Workplace Insight? Are you driven by advertising?
Yeah, we are. But I mean, I think most of our income now comes from things like sponsorship. And, we were already, doing that shift, I think, in the wake of the lockdown. Because the traditional business model for trade media is that you sell ads against content. We all know that, and you serve a market, and in some ways that is still our business model, but it's not the main source of income for us now. So we're shifting again. We're doing other new things later on this year, because we're not going to be able to compete with this. Because traditionally, of course, if you optimize SEO, you get people on the website, and advertisers will look to book ads with you. and that still happens, you know, and our SEO is still pretty good, you know, and we get decent traffic, but it's not what it was. And
Yeah,
I
so
think
the sponsorship model is essentially getting an office furniture firm to sponsor content. You wrote, where are the iconic office furniture products of yesterday? Of course, some people might be slightly uncomfortable with office furniture companies sponsoring that kind of content, because it increasingly becomes like advertising, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but I mean, what I'm really saying in that piece is like, we're not going to go back to that period. I mean, you know, if you look at the way that designers, for example, convey an idea of a certain type of office or a certain type of cool, they go back to modernist classics from, you know, the mid 20th century. They still do that, and a lot of modern designs still kind of ape those sorts of designs because they know people understand the idiom of those products. And I don't think we're going to see, and this is based on conversations we've been having recently with various people, what you're going to do is get refinements of products and also more interesting things like systems and materials rather than a single chair that, you know, turns everybody's heads. So the Aeron chair is the classic example of this, and Mill and Knoll have made this point clear in the conversations we've had for them. You don't expect another Aeron, which is obviously the world's best-selling chair, and you know, but you're not going to do that again.
So when it comes to workplace insights, ultimately you're catering to human beings rather than chairs or office managers. What advice would you give about preparing yourself for the AI revolution? Should you be prepared to retire gracefully, like Thomas More's sheep, or maybe not sheep, the men that were eaten by the sheep? Or should we be arming ourselves, maybe not with chairs or desks, but some ways of protecting ourselves from this AI revolution?
Well, I'm not sure we can protect ourselves, you know, and I'm not, you know, Soylent Green might be better for me. I'm not quite old enough actually to give up, or rich enough to give up just yet. But I think the way that we're pivoting our business, and I'm not saying this is right for everybody else, is, you know, we're doing more roundtables and events, and, you know, getting people together.
I can't resist the roundtables. Maybe you should rename round. I'm always dubious of the term roundtables. Maybe you should call them round chairs.
yeah, it's you know, but I think it's just bringing people together. It's essentially what it is. That is.
Well, that comes back to the loneliness thing. So there's always going to be a market. People want to be around a round table or a round chair with other people talking about these issues.
Yeah, well, you know, and I think in some ways, you know, the office industry in the UK is well suited to this because it's so focused on Clerkenwell in London. So you have a district, a bit like in the American industry is based in Chicago. You know, you can create these sort of agglomeration effects around an industry, and say interesting things to each other. And you know, but like I said, you know, as I said before, I don't think the industry is very good at making a business case for its products, but we're hoping to change that.
Well, finally, I do have to give a plug for Toilet Workers. I'm not sure if you've seen Wim Wenders' movie from 2023 called Perfect Days, but it's a magnificent reminder of the dignity of work. It's a movie about a Japanese toilet worker in Tokyo who has enormous dignity. It's a very moving film. I'm not sure if you've seen it. Anyone who's listening should see it. I don't know anyone who has seen it who didn't love it. But it does remind us of the dignity of work, particularly of physical work. The heroic figure at the heart of Perfect Days was from a white-collar family. I think his father was a professor who bullied him, so he escaped to cleaning toilets, but he enjoyed himself. He listened to music. The Perfect Days reference is to a famous song. I won't ruin it for everyone. He loves cassette players. So is there, Mark, still a dignity, particularly to physical work? The Luddites, of course, who reacted against industrialization, they came from your neck of the woods, not entirely your neck of the woods, but not too far in American terms. Should we still be reminding ourselves of the dignity, not just of physical work, but of intellectual work as we face this mechanized future where it's not just algorithms that will replace smart workers, but ultimately, and I think even in Tokyo these days, there are automated toilet cleaners. So even the hero in Perfect Days will eventually be replaced.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of creative work, I mean, I think like a lot of people, writing is thinking. And, to come back to the conversation we had about the use of the word privilege, me saying, actually, I wrote it and then I thought afterwards, that's not the right word. That is the kind of thing you get from creating things. I think on the broader
what was
point,
the word again? Remind me the word you.
Solipticism, I think, might be better. But in terms of one of the
Richard, sorry I keep on interrupting. I get into trouble for that. But for you, privilege was meant pejoratively. I got the sense it's not a good word if you're privileged. But solipsism isn't necessarily then a bad word. I mean, we are by definition as humans solipsistic.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a trap we all fall into. I'm not. I wouldn't sort of say I'm immune to it either. And and that like I said, I've written something and then afterwards think, yeah, actually, I could have said that slightly differently and perhaps in a better way. But that's always the case, isn't it? It's you've written things and afterwards you go back to them, you think, all right, okay, I could have done that better. But in terms of the point about, I remember there's a fantastic essay on Aeon. I don't know if you subscribe to any of that stuff, which sort of reminds people that the experience of their daily lives is going to be shaped more by maintainers than by creators. And it's a really interesting point to make. The early feminists used to talk about the work that women did in the home, for example, as shit work. So it's the kind of work that. Sorry, is swearing okay?
No, yeah, of course. It's encouraged, actually.
Yeah, there you go. So it's the sort of job that people only notice if it doesn't get done, and nothing will ruin somebody's day more quickly than a toilet that doesn't work, or if there's no toilet roll or whatever it might be. That is just a fact, and I don't know if Enders plays on that idea in his piece. But
well, it would be. I mean, that would be the title. Then he would title the movie "Imperfect Day."
Well, there you go. But it's true though, isn't it? And I know people, if they go into a restaurant or a bar or something, they will often judge it based on the state of the toilets. So even if the front of the house is pristine, if they've got dirty toilets, you've got a problem, haven't you? And
and understandably, if your toilets are filthy, it probably doesn't suggest that your kitchens are particularly
well. Exactly. People will judge it on things like that. So, but that's a maintenance issue, not So maybe it's a massively well appointed toilet, but it's dirty. So people will judge you on that, not the fact that you've got really nice sort of tap fittings. And I think that is true of things like work across the board as well. We should appreciate more the people who maintain the world than who create it. Actually, no, I think, that's, again, it's not a zero-sum game, is it? We should just appreciate the people who maintain the world more.
Yeah, and I think The Office brings out interestingly enough, or work at least, brings out our most philosophical. Enders is one of the world's great philosophers. His book, his movie, Perfect Days, is a masterpiece. You reference in some of your work J.G. Ballard, who is perhaps the most philosophical of all 20th century English writers, who imagined perfect and certainly imperfect futures. Mark, you're doing the same thing in your own way at Workplace Insight. You're doing it solipsistically, but in a good solipsistic way, if there's such a thing. Honored to have you on the show. Very interesting conversation. Thinking of doing more stuff on work, on the future of work, maybe with Julia. We'll have to get you back on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an honor. Thank you.